Boom, and just like that, it is week 10 of the fantasy season, so you know exactly what we need to do. We're going to go through every single matchup, talk about every single wide receiver, and go over who you should be starting and who you should be sitting here in week 10 of the fantasy season. Very quickly here, we have 4 teams on bye week here in week 10, the Tennessee Titans, the Cincinnati Bengals, the Kansas City Chiefs, and the Dallas Cowboys. So make sure you guys are checking your lineups and making adjustments accordingly. All right, let's kick it off with Thursday Night Football. We're going to have the Raiders traveling to face the Broncos. Let's start with the Raiders side of things. This is a tough matchup for them. Even without Pat Surtain, the Broncos are still ranking a 3rd overall in terms of fantasy points allowed to the wide receiver position. They've only given up 2 total receiving touchdowns on the season to opposing wide receivers. We know that this is a very stiff defense. It's a short week. These Thursday night football games have been pretty high scoring for the most part this year. And I mean, Geno Smith is coming off of a game where he looked like a competent quarterback and threw 4 passing touchdowns, but that didn't really benefit wide receivers like Jacoby Myers or Trey Tucker. So, I mean, if you guys are absolutely desperate, I guess there's some sort of floor with potentially starting Myers or Trey Tucker. And I'm going into this video assuming that Jacoby Myers is not getting traded. Of course, if he's traded, then that'll change everything here. But still, I just don't think that I would start any Raiders wide receiver here in week 10. Trey Tucker, 6.8 fantasy points this past week. Jacoby Myers, 6.3 fantasy points. I just have no interest in any of these Raiders wide receivers moving into week 10. Then we move to the Broncos side of things. I was a little bit back and forth on Courtland Sutton in week 9. Wasn't a great matchup really for any of the Broncos against the Texans defense. And that secondary has been pretty stingy, giving up the second fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. But Derek Stingley has been a little bit inconsistent this year. And so, like I said, I was a little bit back and forth in terms of recommendations with Courtland Sutton this past weekend. He was okay, got 10 fantasy points. He had 6 targets, just 1 catch, a 30-yard touchdown, and that was it. So at least if you started him, you got somewhat of a floor. He didn't absolutely kill you, but this is a great spot for him to bounce back against the Raiders, who have been a bottom 5 unit in terms of fantasy points allowed to opposing wide receivers. So gotta feel good about Sutton this week. And I know if you guys went out and spent a lot of fab on Troy Franklin, maybe you're feeling like that was a mistake, but he did have 10 targets this past week, so that's 3 straight games with 8 or more targets, and this is a really good spot for him. If he's going to get some sort of involvement, it could easily be this week against, once again, a very, very bad Raiders team when it comes to opposing wide receivers. So I do think Troy Franklin is a risky flex option here in week 10, but these are really the only 2 wide receivers I would consider in this matchup. I love this matchup so much for the Broncos wide receivers that I'm headed straight to Underdog to take the over on Courtland Sutton to score a receiving touchdown here in week 10. I think you could also take Troy Franklin. They have a very good matchup overall. And don't forget, all new users who sign up on Underdog using promo code THECATCH are getting a free NFL Pick Em to use towards week 10 NFL action. Take that free Pick Em. Take one of the Broncos wide receivers to score a touchdown. And if both of those lines hit, you're going to automatically double your cash entry. And on top of that, once you play through $5 on Underdog, as long as you signed up using promo code THECATCH, that link is down below, Underdog is also going to give you $50 in bonus cash to use towards Week 10 NFL action. So make sure you guys sign up on Underdog using promo code THECATCH if you want to take advantage of all of their Week 10 exclusive NFL offers. All right, Sunday morning, we're going to get a overseas matchup between the Falcons and the Colts. This should be a pretty straightforward one, but let's start with the Falcons. Drake London coming off of his best fantasy performance of the season so far with 38.8 fantasy points, a whopping 3 receiving touchdowns off of just 9 receptions, had 118 receiving yards and 14 targets. You are starting Drake London basically no matter what. I know we've seen some ups and downs, like he missed week 8. Week 7, just 8.2 fantasy points. Week 6, 31.8 fantasy points. Like, it's been a bit all over the place. Nonetheless, the upside is way too high. And the Colts this past week were pretty good against opposing wide receivers, but ultimately they're still a bottom 10 unit when it comes to fantasy points allowed to opposing wide receivers. They've given up over 1,400 total receiving yards and 9 receiving touchdowns on the season. So, smash spot for Drake London. He's a very strong start moving into the week. Darnell Mooney had 1 catch in week 9. He also had 1 catch in week 8 and just 3 catches in week 7. He's been pretty underwhelming, and that's even with, Michael Penix having success at the quarterback position this past week. So staying away from Darnell Mooney. I don't even think he needs to be rostered in most leagues moving forward. We take a look at the Colts wide receivers who are both coming off as strong games here. Michael Pittman, 20.5 fantasy points, 12 targets, 9 catches, 115 receiving yards. Then Josh Downs, 9 targets, 6 catches, 57 receiving yards, and a touchdown. He had 15.7 fantasy points. So I feel good about both these guys going into the week. The Falcons have been pretty stingy, top 8 when it comes to fantasy points allowed to opposing wide receivers, but I just don't feel like you can afford to bench either of these players, especially Michael Pittman. But I do think that Josh Downs has been really underrated over the past couple of weeks, and we've talked a lot about him as being a strong flex option. He just kind of has gotten bumped up to the low-end start category. Doesn't see a massive amount of volume, but is still involved in this offense that's putting up a lot of points. And they're coming off of a tough loss and everything. I think they're going to come out here swinging against the Falcons. So I like Pittman and Downs quite a bit this week. And it's worth noting, Alec Pierce, 17.5 fantasy points this past week. He does get involvement as well. He's had double digits in 2 of the last 4 games and ultimately in 4 games on the season, although he's also missed 2 games this year. He gets involvement, but he's just a lot more boom or bust. I feel like the floor is much, much safer with Josh Downs. So I think Downs a good start this week. Pittman, Drake London, both going to be must-start wide receivers for me here in week 10. Moving along to the early window on Sunday, we're going to have the Browns traveling to face the Jets. Both of these teams coming off of their bye week. Does that mean anything for the Browns wide receivers? No, it really doesn't. And he's not on the screen, but I do think that Cedric Tillman has been designated to return from IR, so he will be around as well. Jerry Jeudy is here, and Isaiah Bond is also still hanging around, although Isaiah Bond is now dealing with an injury. And sorry for not having Cedric Tillman's name on the screen there. Should get that updated, but I have no interest in any Browns wide receiver whatsoever moving forward, despite Dylan Gabriel throwing the football 35 times in Week 8, the last time we saw the Browns in action. The 3 wide receivers I just mentioned combined for 0 fantasy points. If we look at the next man up here, it's Malachi Corley. Also had 0 fantasy points in week 8. So just no thank you. There's nothing to go over here when it comes to the Browns wide receivers, staying away from everybody involved. Now, at this point in the week, don't know if Garrett Wilson's going to be able to play in week 10 or not. He has returned to practice. According to early reports here on the week. So if Garrett Wilson plays this week, I think he's always startable. The Browns have really fallen back in their overall rankings against wide receivers, pretty stiff against quarterbacks and running backs, but they've still allowed over 1,000 receiving yards and 10 receiving touchdowns to opposing wide receivers so far this year. So if Garrett Wilson plays, really the only playable wide receiver in this matchup for either team. Anybody else on this Jets offense at the wide receiver position, just no thank you. So we don't really need to talk about anything more here. If Garrett Wilson's healthy here in week 10, he's the only player in this matchup that I would start. Moving along, we're going to have the Saints traveling to face the Panthers. Let's start with the Saints side of things. We saw Tyler Shuck at the quarterback position getting the start in week 9. That wasn't really good for our guy Chris Olave, who had been on a roll with double digits in every single game on the season until this past week. Just 4 targets, 3 catches, 57 receiving yards. We saw Rashid Shaheed get a bit more involvement, 9 targets, 5 grabs, 68 receiving yards, 11.8 fantasy points for him. There are loose rumors at the time I'm recording this that Rashid Shaheed may or may not get traded. There's even rumors that Chris Olave gets traded. I'm just assuming the time recording this, that they're both on the Saints by the time this video comes out. I do think it's worth noting that this Carolina Panthers defense has been really underrated on the year. They've given up the fourth fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers on the year, so top 5 against opposing wide receivers. So, I think really with the quarterback situation and everything here, we just have to view this wide receiver room the same way on a week-to-week basis. Chris Olave is a low-end start. Rashid Shaheed always has flex appeal. He's risky, but he always has some sort of upside as well. But like I said, not a great matchup here. I think both these guys, to a degree, are still startable, though. And hopefully the quarterback position with Tyler Shuck being the primary quarterback at the moment, hopefully we can start to get things going here to where these guys are benefiting more from a fantasy perspective. All right, then we have T-Mac for the Carolina Panthers, just 8.6 fantasy points this past week, 6 targets, 4 grabs, 46 receiving yards. We really saw Rico Dowdle dominate this game, and that was like the only thing that was happening on offense for the Panthers this past week, which is not entirely surprising. Passing game overall was just really underwhelming. Bryce Young was 11 of 20 passing the football, 102 passing yards, an interception, and a fumble. So, yeah, I mean, come on. And when it comes to this offense, like, Tet is a low-end start, and that's it. It's a decent enough matchup against the Saints secondary, but you really can't expect a whole lot from this passing attack for the Panthers. So that's all I've got for you guys. If you own T-Mac, it just depends on who else you guys have. Any other Panthers wide receiver, I have no interest in whatsoever. Moving into Week 10. Next up, we have the Patriots, who are going to travel to face the Buccaneers. Let's start with the Patriots side of things. Stephon Diggs, a solid enough performance in Week 9, 12.8 fantasy points. Pretty low volume, 4 targets, 3 grabs, 38 receiving yards. But he scored a touchdown, his second on the season. You got to feel pretty good here. I mean, the Bucs have been pretty decent against opposing wide receivers, but nonetheless, I just feel like this is going to be one of those matchups where the passing volume, will be high for both teams involved, and the potential for points is going to be high as well. Now, you guys may notice Kayshon Boutte's not on the screen. I may have been premature in taking him off of the screen for you guys, but he is dealing with a hamstring issue. His status for Week 10 is up in the air, and my assumption is that he was just going to miss Week 10, but it looks like he actually has a shot to play, according to some early reporting. So if he plays, same deal, risky flex every single week, and that's it. So that will impact the potential for Demario Douglas to do something. We saw 20 fantasy points for him in Week 9, 6 targets, 4 grabs, exactly 100 receiving yards, and he scored a touchdown. So I don't know that I'm going to go out of my way to start Demario Douglas, and I would only consider doing so if Kayshon Boutte misses Week 10, and it would have to be like a desperation situation. I know we talked about in the waiver wire video, but once again, these are like kind of desperation streamers, so to speak, at the wide receiver position. And I would really kind of view Kayshon Boutte not full on desperation, but close to it. He's still a very risky flex option. So we'll have to see as the week goes on if he's going to play or not, and that leaves a potential window for Demario Douglas here in Week 10. But regardless, Stephon Diggs should be a good low-end start for you guys. Now, the Bucs are coming off of their bye week. Last 3 games we've seen Emeka Egbuka play him, 9.8 or less fantasy points, and this is a pretty stiff matchup. The Patriots defense has been pretty stingy overall. They're 13th overall in fantasy points allowed to wide receivers, so it's not a great matchup, but once again, you just got to expect points in this game, the passing volume to be high for both teams. So I'm going to trust in Emeka Egbuka coming off of a week of extra rest and preparation to have a decent enough game at home in what feels like a game that the Buccaneers need to win, and that the Patriots probably very likely want to win just as much. So leave Egbuka as a start. Don't know if Chris Godwin's going to play here in Week 10 as he's dealing with that leg injury, and maybe Tez Johnson or Sterling Shepard or somebody else here can step up and have a decent game, but I just really don't want to risk it. Emeka Egbuka, the only Buccaneers wide receiver that I would consider starting here in Week 10. Next up, we have the Ravens traveling to face the Vikings. Zay Flowers in Week 9 against the Dolphins, 11.4 fantasy points, 5 targets, 5 grabs, 64 receiving yards with Lamar Jackson back in action this past week's Thursday Night Football matchup. This week they'll be facing the Vikings. This is a unit that ranks 8th overall in terms of fantasy points allowed to wide receivers on the season. So not really a great matchup here, but really regardless, I just view Zay Flowers as a low-end start every single week. Probably not going to kill you if he's in your starting lineup. Probably going to get around double digits, but the upside just really isn't there. He's only scored 1 touchdown on the season. That is all the way back in week 1 of the season. Anybody else here? I know Rashad Bateman scored this past week, but that was just his 2nd touchdown on the year, and he's only had double digits once on the season, and he didn't even do it this past week when he scored, right? DeAndre Hopkins, whoever else is here, they're all just sits for me. They're not getting enough involvement for us to trust them. Then we move over to the Vikings side of things. This is a good matchup for them. The Ravens are getting a little bit healthier. They're slowly somewhat moving up in their overall rankings, but nonetheless, they're still a bottom 5 unit against opposing wide receivers when it comes to fantasy points allowed. And Justin Jefferson is as safe as a start as you're going to get. And it was nice to see J.J. McCarthy look pretty decent at the quarterback position this past week. Was 14 of 25, only 143 passing yards, but he threw 2 passing touchdowns, ran for a touchdown as well for what it's worth. But one of those touchdowns went to Justin Jefferson. He had 9 targets, 6 grabs, 47 receiving yards, and 8 touchdowns, 16.7 fantasy points. If you own Justin Jefferson and he's healthy, you're starting him every single week, no matter what. Jordan Addison, not so great this past week. 4 targets, but just 2 receptions, no touchdowns, 48 receiving yards, 8.4 fantasy points, but I still believe in Jordan Addison, and due to the matchup, I'm going to leave him as a start here in week 10 of the season. Don't forget, he still has had double digits in 4 out of the last 5 games, and 4 of the 5 games he's actually played in on the season. So good matchup. The Vikings are at home. Maybe they can build off of the momentum that they had last week, beating arguably the best team in the NFL. So I like Jordan Addison just fine here in week 10 of the season. But along, we got the Bills traveling to face the Dolphins in a little divisional matchup. Hopefully it's not a one-sided affair. Let's start with the Bills. Khalil Shakir, every week, low-end start, safe floor for the most part, 11.3 fantasy points this past week, 8 targets, 7 grabs, 43 receiving yards. He's just one of these guys that you can trust on a week-in, week-out basis. Now, we look at the Dolphins. They've technically given up the fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. 938 receiving yards allowed, 8 receiving touchdowns. They just give up so many points to running backs that teams don't need to throw a ton against them. So I feel like this ranking's a little bit skewed. They've also only given up 84 receptions. It is tied for the 4th fewest in the NFL. So I don't know. Take that with a grain of salt. I think that the Bills are going to have a pretty good day here in Week 10, even on the road. I mean, these divisional matchups can always get weird, but I think Khalil Shakir is a solid start. And then anybody else here, I just don't trust any other Bills wide receiver. I haven't trusted any other Bills wide receiver all season long. Keon Coleman, Josh Palmer, who is dealing with some injuries, probably won't even play this week. Whoever it is, they are sits for me. Then we move to the Dolphins side of things. Till further notice, Jalen Waddle is just going to remain in the start category. There's really nobody else to throw to. I mean, I know we've seen a little bit of involvement sprinkled in from Malik Washington in the last 2 weeks. Devon Achane gets some volume at the running back position. Greg Dulcich is the latest tight end to get volume on this team as they've dealt with a ton of injuries at tight end. But yeah, I would expect that the Bills defense is going to come out here and play pretty well, with Tua coming off of a poor performance in week 9. But then again, you never know. Tua was super good in week 8 and threw 4 passing touchdowns, was 20 of 26. So who knows what Dolphins team we're going to get here. Regardless, this is a good spot for Jalen Waddle, mainly because he gets all of the volume. It's not the greatest matchup against the Bills, but Waddle will see the volume in terms of receiving work for the Dolphins. So we're going to leave him as a start here in Week 10 of the season. Except we're going to have the Giants traveling to face the Bears. Let's start with the Giants side of things. Rondale Robinson continues to be solid on a week-to-week basis. 13.6 fantasy points in Week 9, 11 targets, 9 grabs, 46 receiving yards. So double digits in 3 of the last 4 games. Really is the primary target for Jackson Dart at the quarterback position. And I would imagine with, the running game not being very strong this past week with no Cam Scatterbo, they're going to continue to need to throw to Robinson. This is a pretty good matchup against the Chicago Bears, who are now bottom 5 in terms of fantasy points allowed to opposing wide receivers, and they have given up 13 receiving touchdowns, which is the second most in the NFL. So got to feel pretty good about Robinson, even if, Jackson Dart's passing volume isn't like super high. He's only thrown for over 200 passing yards in 2 of his starts on the season, and he's only thrown for over 280 passing yards in 1 of his starts. So volume not super high, but once again, they're kind of limited. It's Robinson, Slayton, Theo Johnson in terms of receiving work for almost the entirety here. So Robinson, good low-end start this week. I do think Darius Slayton is flexible. We talked about him in the waiver video. Once again, it's a good matchup. He had 7 targets in week 9, 5 catches, 62 receiving yards, 11.2 fantasy points. I don't see a crazy ceiling or anything, but the floor is definitely there if you guys need a last-minute plug-and-play for the flex spot. Darius Slayton should be solid in full PPR formats. Then we move to the Bears. I mean, maybe not everyone's going to agree with this, but I still have Rome Odunze as a low-end start. I've kind of kept the faith, and it didn't work out for 2 weeks, week 6 and 7, 5.2 or less fantasy points, and told you guys, let's keep rolling with Rome. He's got a good matchup against the Ravens. He came through in that matchup. Then this past week, 47 and 42 were the total points scored by each team in this game. And Rome Odunze has 3 targets, 0 catches, 0 fantasy points. I don't know how that is even humanly possible, but it happened. But we just got to move on to the next week. It's a good matchup. The Giants are a bottom 8 unit in terms of fantasy points allowed to opposing wide receivers. So I think this is a good bounce back spot for Rome Odunze here in week 10 of the season. I'm just not going to overthink it. Low end start. Could depend on what else you guys have. And we'll just leave it at that. And when it comes to DJ Moore on a week in, week out basis, he's always a flex option. I mean, I know he's coming off of his best game on the season. He did benefit from that high scoring affair this past week. 6 targets, 4 catches, 72 receiving yards, 22 fantasy points because he also threw a passing touchdown. So ultimately, flexible, but the floor is still very unstable. That was just his 3rd double-digit performance of the year, and his other 2 were 12.8 or less fantasy points. So flexible. I do expect some points scored in this game by both teams. I don't know if it's going to be as crazy as the Bears last week, but ultimately this should be a solid matchup for the wide receiver position across the board. Closing out the early window, we're going to have the Jaguars traveling to face the Texans. Let's start with the Jaguars side of things. Tough matchup this week as the Texans have allowed the 2nd fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers and just 4 receiving touchdowns on the entire season to wide receivers. So BTJ a little banged up this past week. Just 8.5 fantasy points, 5 targets, 3 catches, 55 receiving yards, dealing with that ankle issue. May or may not play. If he plays, flexible. That's it. Like I said, this is a tough matchup against the Texans. Derek Stingley has been pretty inconsistent against wide receiver ones this year, but overall the secondary is playing well, and the defense is playing well, just not giving up a ton of points overall. We look on this season, when it comes to passing touchdowns, they've allowed just 8 passing touchdowns on the year. So this is a really, really stingy defense. And like I said, 4 of those touchdowns to wide receivers. So yeah, Brian Thomas flexible. We talked about Parker Washington as the top waiver pickup this week. 17 fantasy points this past week, 9 targets, 8 grabs, 90 receiving yards. I still don't think I will call him more than a flex, whether BTJ plays or not here in week 10 of the season, because it is such a tough matchup. But flexible if you guys have nothing better, especially if BTJ doesn't play, I think you could argue. But even if BTJ does play, maybe that helps out, less defensive pressure, all that stuff. Then Dewami Brown would be the next man up here, but he's dealing with a concussion. So not exactly sure what we're going to get in terms of this Jaguars wide receiver room here in week 10, but it's looking as if we might be just looking at Parker Washington as the primary wide receiver. So the volume should be there for him. The matchup, definitely not beneficial. Now, Nico Collins, encourage you guys to start him last week as long as he was healthy. He played 11 targets, 7 grabs, 75 receiving yards, 14.5 fantasy points. Going to leave him in the start category against the Jaguars here in week 10, as they are still a bottom 12 unit against opposing wide receivers so far on the season. But I will say if CJ Stroud doesn't play in week 10, I don't know exactly what we're going to get out of Davis Mills at the quarterback position in this Jaguars defense, although they haven't been playing as great the past couple of weeks on the season. They've still been very opportunistic in terms of like creating turnovers. So Nico, still a good low-end start either way, but I'm not going to call him more than that. Would probably feel more confident if we do see CJ Stroud as the starting quarterback, but don't know if he's in a clear concussion protocol at this point in the week. Anybody else here is just way too inconsistent. I mean, it'd be really nice to see one of these other wide receivers like really turn into something fantasy relevant here on the season, but I just don't know that it's going to happen. I mean, Jaden Higgins, 1.4 fantasy points this past week, and that made me notice that his name was spelt wrong on the screen, so I'm sorry. You guys can go ahead and yell at me in the comments down below, but nobody noticed last week either. Anyways, Jaden Higgins this past week, 1.4 fantasy points. Jalen Noel, negative 0.3. Xavier Hutchinson, 6. Christian Kirk, 6.6. So there's nothing here. Like Dalton Schultz is the next, most relevant player at the tight end position when it comes to volume in this passing game. So Nico Collins, and that is it for me and the Texans here in Week 10. Moving along, let's go to the afternoon slate, starting with the Cardinals traveling to face the Seattle Seahawks. Now, as always, I have to record these videos before Monday Night Football has been played, so if anything crazy happens with basically Marvin Harrison Jr. or any of the other Cardinals wide receivers, I'll let you guys know my thoughts in a pinned comment down below. But I think Marvin Harrison Jr. is going to have a solid day against the Cowboys, if not a really good day, as they have been the worst team against opposing wide receivers here in the 2025 season. So I think Marvin Harrison Jr. will be a solid low-end start, regardless of what happens on Monday Night Football, because the Seattle Seahawks defense, nothing to sneeze at. Top 10 against opposing wide receivers so far on the season, coming off of a big performance against the Washington Commanders in prime time. So Marvin Harrison Jr., definitely startable, but kind of a lower end start. Even if he has a big game against the Cowboys, just keep in mind this is going to be a different type of game here in Week 10 on the road against a divisional opponent. But worth noting, in Week 4, when Marvin Harrison Jr. faced his team, he did have 18.6 fantasy points and a touchdown, but also don't know at this point in the week who's going to be the starting quarterback, Jacoby Brissett or Kyler Murray, for what it's worth. Than any other wide receiver, Michael Wilson, Greg Dortch, just no thank you. No thank you. I mean, this offense is so conservative. Hopefully they open up things on Monday Night Football against the Cowboys. All right, Jackson Smith and Jigba, pretty easy. You guys know exactly what you're going to get here. He is a start, no matter what. 22 fantasy points, 9 targets, 8 grabs, 129 receiving yards for him in Week 9. He is the wide receiver 1 or the wide receiver 2, depending on your scoring format, but still a top 2 wide receiver in half and full PPR so far in the season. Start him no matter what. Don't overthink it. Now, I left Torrey Horton as a sit, which is kind of a mistake. He should be in like the flex area, so sorry, screwing things up here for you guys. And Cooper Kupp, who knows if he's going to play in Week 10 or not, as he missed Week 9 dealing with a hamstring and heel issue. So if Horton, if Cooper Kupp doesn't play, I think Horton is flexible. And if you guys have been following the channel, I mean, we've talked about Torrey Horton throughout the year. We talked a lot about him in the offseason. But what I want you guys to keep in mind is that the volume is so low here. He hasn't had a single game this year with over 4 targets, and this past week against Washington was his first game with more than 3 catches. Every game that he's had double digits this year, he has scored at least 1 touchdown. If he doesn't score a touchdown, he's given you 2 or less fantasy points, including multiple games with 0 fantasy points. So he's still very risky. And the Cardinals don't have the worst secondary in the league. So, they've also been a little bit unhealthy and all that. But yeah, this is a top 12 unit against opposing wide receivers before Monday Night Football has been played. Maybe CeeDee Lamb and George Pickens changed that, but yeah, I mean, before Monday Night Football has been played, they've only given up 3 receiving touchdowns on the year. So I don't really love this spot for Torrey Horton, even if Cooper Kupp doesn't play, but he's a risky flex, and we'll leave it at that. Just bear in mind, the volume has been really, really low for Torrey Horton overall on the season. Moving along, we got the Lions traveling to face the Commanders. Let's start with the Lions side of things. Amon-Ra St. Brown, 18.7 fantasy points this past week, 13 targets, 9 grabs, 97 receiving yards, and you got to feel good about him. This Commanders team is beat up across the board, bottom 10 against opposing wide receivers, and I think this team is really drastically starting to fall. and could be in a very dangerous spot at this point in the season. Before Monday Night Football has been played, they've given up the second most receiving yards on the season to wide receivers. That could change, being that the Cowboys are playing on Monday Night Football. But yeah, they've also given up 11 receiving touchdowns. This is a great spot for the Lions, who need a bounce-back performance after losing to the Vikings this past week. So you got to feel great if you own Amon-Ra St. Brown, and I'm still leaving Jameson Williams as the riskiest flex ever. He has, earned himself that crown, but nice performance in week 9, scored that impressive touchdown, 6 targets, 4 grabs, 66 receiving yards in the touchdown, 16.6 fantasy points. But just bear in mind, the game we saw him previously, he had 0 fantasy points. The week before that, he had 18.6. The week before that, he had 2 fantasy points. So still remains a very risky flex, but it is a good spot for him against this depleted Washington Commanders team. Debo, Terry, what are we going to do here? Terry, I feel like he's not going to play in week 10. Most of the early reporting is indicating that he's not going to play in week 10. I think more than likely he's going to continue to nurse that quad injury. Don't forget the Commanders have a bye week in week 12, but with Jaden Daniels dealing with his issues, don't be surprised if Terry McLaurin is on the sidelines for a while as well, not risking any further injury to that quad. Luke McCaffrey headed to IR with a broken collarbone, so maybe we see some impact for a guy like Chris Moore or Jalen Lame. I'm not starting either of those guys. If Terry's able to play, he's a risky flex, and that's it. It'll probably just be Debo out there. He's a risky flex. The volume should be good because it's really just him and Zach Ertz at the end of the day. Marcus Mariota is going to get the start at quarterback. The Lions still haven't been great against opposing wide receivers, bottom 10 unit when it comes to fantasy points allowed. So there could be something here, but I just got a bad feeling for the Commanders' offense here in Week 10, especially with the Lions coming off of a loss to a divisional opponent. So ultimately, Debo's really the only player I consider, because I don't think Terry's actually going to play this week, but just in case, he's on the screen for you guys. And that's it. I'm not risking Chris Moore or Jalen Lane or any of these other Commanders wide receivers here in week 10. Wrapping up the afternoon slate, we have the Rams traveling to face the Niners, and Puka Nacua. Another injury, will it matter? I'm not sure. Dealing with a rib issue. Still had 22.8 fantasy points this past week, 8 targets, 7 grabs, 95 receiving yards, and a touchdown. As long as he plays, doesn't matter who he's facing. Doesn't matter if he's coming off the injury report super late in the week, whatever. Puka Nacua is in your starting lineup. And we talked a lot about Davante Adams this past week, had him in the nuclear video. He had 2 receiving touchdowns, 7 targets, 5 grabs, 60 receiving yards, and 23 fantasy points. In my eyes, Davante Adams is just as much of a must-start as Puka Nacua on a week-to-week basis. Puka is a top 5 wide receiver in both half and full PPR. Davante Adams is a top 8 wide receiver in both half and full PPR. He has the most red zone targets of any wide receiver in the NFL. And Matthew Stafford is playing at an MVP caliber pace right now. He has 9 passing touchdowns in the last 2 games, and this offense is slinging the football right now. So Davante Adams remains a start for me, but unfortunately, those are really the only 2 names here. Anybody else left over for the Rams wide receivers we're not considering. Then we move to the Niners side of things. The Rams have moved up a bit in their rankings against wide receivers, but they still haven't been great this year, 19th overall. Jawan Jennings did score a touchdown this past week, 5 targets, 4 grabs, 41 receiving yards, and 14.1 fantasy points for him. Kendrick Bourne didn't do a whole lot, even with Mac Jones back as the starting quarterback, just 2 targets, 2 grabs, 5.4 fantasy points. I mean, Christian McCaffrey was tearing it up. They didn't really need to throw the football. And then we got Ricky Pearsall, right? I mean, is he going to play? Maybe. Could return in week 10 is what the reports are saying. Could miss another 4 weeks. I don't know. And speaking of injured Niners, is it going to be Brock Purdy or Mac Jones at quarterback this week? I don't know. Does anybody know what's ever going on with these Niners players at this point in the season? So they're all risky flexes. Kendrick Bourne being my least favorite, as he really hasn't shown up in the last 3 weeks, even with Mac Jones at the quarterback position, which is supposed to be like the thing that benefited him. Jawan Jennings, you never know what you're going to get. I mean, he literally just had his second double-digit performance of the year, and he's only had double-digit performances when he has scored touchdowns. So risky flexes, that's all the Niners wide receivers are here in Week 10. All right, Sunday Night Football, we got the Steelers traveling to face the Chargers. Let's start with the Steelers side of things. DK Metcalf disappeared in Week 2.6 fantasy points in a good matchup against the Colts, but they did get some added help coming off an injury in their secondary, and that definitely showed this past week. 4 targets, 2 grabs, 6 receiving yards, and I thought it was going to be a great spot for Metcalf. It was not, and this Chargers unit pretty stingy against wide receivers, 6 overall in terms of fantasy points allowed to the position, so I can't call Metcalf more than a low-end start, but I still think he's going to be startable and can bounce back from last week, but don't know if the upside is as high. But don't forget, he still has 5 receiving touchdowns through 9 games, or 8 games played on the season, Calvin Austin, 10.6 fantasy points this past week, and Roman Wilson disappeared with negative fantasy points after having a nice Week 8 performance. So can't trust either of those guys, and Metcalf, not a high ceiling, just a low-end start for me in Week 10. Then we move to arguably the most frustrating wide receiver room in the entire NFL, the Chargers wide receivers. Ladd McConkey is going to leave as a low-end start. I know he disappointed this past week, but he still had 7 targets, only came up with 9.6 fantasy points, but you got to like this matchup. The Steelers have allowed over 1,500 receiving yards to opposing wide receivers on the season, and they've given up 7 receiving touchdowns, which is actually kind of low compared to other teams, but they rank as the second worst team in the NFL in terms of fantasy points allowed to wide receivers, and they've given up a massive 129 total receptions on the season, which is the most in the NFL, unless the Cowboys. The Cowboys have only given up 96 receptions, so I don't think even before Monday Night Football, I still think the Steelers are going to have the most receptions allowed, and they have the second most targets allowed to wide receivers on the season as well, for what it's worth. So this is a good spot for the Chargers wide receivers, but we're kind of playing this carousel on a week-to-week basis with these guys. I got some comments last week because I had Keenan Allen and Quentin Johnston in the same spot, and people are like, that doesn't make any sense, but it makes perfect sense. I know QJ blanked in Week 8, but Keenan Allen only had 8.4 fantasy points in Week 8. Then this past week, Keenan Allen, 6.1 fantasy points. Quentin Johnston scores a touchdown, so 15.3 fantasy points. So they're all over the place, but any of these guys can score, and it's a great matchup for all of them. So Keenan Allen, Quentin Johnston, still flexible. Ladd McConkey, still seeing the best overall volume on a week-to-week basis. So he's a start. Really should be like a low-end start, I guess you could argue. But this is a matchup that I would take if I owned Ladd McConkey, and I wouldn't overthink it. Let's leave him as a start, actually. I'll take that back. And Keenan Allen, Quentin Johnston, both worth a flex here in Week 10 of the season. All right, to wrap it all up on Monday Night Football, we have the Eagles traveling to face the Packers. Let's start with the Eagles side of things. Haven't seen them in a week as they are coming off of their bye week. A.J. Brown reportedly maybe getting traded. I highly doubt it, but the last time we saw him in action was actually Week 7 as he missed Week 8 of the season, but he had 28.1 fantasy points. Devonta Smith, the last time we saw him, 14.4 fantasy points in Week 8 with no A.J. Brown. Listen, these guys are always startable on a weekly basis, and still in my eyes should probably be in your starting lineup if you own them on a week-to-week basis. The Packers, not great against opposing wide receivers. Could be better, could be worse, but 17th overall. It's a decent spot here. I always watch out for teams coming off of their bye week. Extra time to prepare, mental notes, rest, all that stuff. I like both the Eagles wide receivers here in Week 10 of the season. This should be a good kind of primetime game with 2 good teams overall. Then we look to the Packers. Romeo Doubs. I think this is actually a decent spot for him. I don't love if he's going to see a lot of Quinyon Mitchell, but he was solid in Week 9, 16.1 fantasy points, 10 targets, 7 grabs, 91 receiving yards. And once again, the Eagles just rank kind of middle of the pack, 16th overall against opposing wide receivers. Whoever Quinyon Mitchell's on, it's probably not going to be the best day here, but the rest of the secondary is still allowing enough in terms of fantasy points allowed on the season. So I think risky flex for Romeo Doubs. I think that Christian Watson could also be a risky flex. We look over the past 2 weeks, he's had 21.2 or more yards per catch. Last week, 29 yards per catch, but he's had 4 or less receptions in each of the 2 games he's played on the season. So as risky as a flex as you're going to get next to a guy like Jameson Williams, right? It's just hard to call right now. We haven't seen him play in a lot of games this year, but Matthew Golden is dealing with that shoulder issue, considered day-to-day. Maybe that opens up more volume for Christian Watson. Then again, in the last 3 games, we're looking at 4 or less targets for Matthew Golden. Maybe the more impactful thing here is that Tucker Kraft is done for the year with the ACL injury, unfortunately. So the Packers will be forced to throw the football more to the wide receiver position, although Luke Musgrave is a serviceable tight end as well. He's just no Tucker Kraft, right? So Dobbs, Watson should be in line for more volume. This should be a competitive game script overall. They're both risky flexes, though, is all I can call them. A.J. Brown, Devonta Smith, both low-end starts, but solid starts at the same time here in Week 10 of the season. You guys have it. Every single matchup, every single wide receiver, who you should be starting, who you should be sitting here in Week 10 of the fantasy season. Don't forget, guys, I'm answering as many fantasy football questions as I can in the comment section down below. So if you guys need anything whatsoever, moving into Week 10, please drop me a comment. I'll answer as many as I can throughout the week. And while you guys are down there, helps me out tremendously, does the channel a huge favor if you guys subscribe and hit that like button on the way out. And when the videos and playlists pop up on the screen as the week progresses, we're going to have everything that you could possibly need to dominate Week 10 of the fantasy season. So make sure you guys go check out all the content as it comes out this week. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.